Throughout the early 1990s, a Japanese company called Square had cemented themselves as an elite publisher and developer of video games. This meant that by the end of 1993, across the Game Boy and Super Famicom, they had managed to release 7 games that had topped 1 million copies sold in Japan. Outside of Nintendo, this kind of performance was unmatched. Rival publishers did have strong IPs that could sell well, with Capcom having Street Fighter and Enix with Dragon Quest. But Square had something these other publishers lacked: a bounty of powerful and profitable IPs that were relevant in this new era of gaming. The launch of Final Fantasy VI then propelled Square even further. And this set the stage for the company to take their dominance over the Japanese market and assert itself on a global scale. But for this to happen, a few pieces of the puzzle still had to align. They came from unexpected partnerships, fortuitous delays, and an audience that was ready and waiting for something new. And something new they got, as when Square went to market with a game called Final Fantasy VII, it changed everything. But a few years before that fateful release, Square had started production on a very different version of Final Fantasy VII. It was to be released on the Super Famicom as a quick successor to Final Fantasy VI, and a swan song for the franchise within that particular console generation. 2 major factors influenced this decision, and another major factor then led to its eventual cancellation. It makes the lost version of Final Fantasy VII a fascinating topic. So let's dive in and explore what those major factors were. By the time Final Fantasy VI was released, thoughts had already been moving on to the next generation of consoles. Both those in professional and consumer circles were desperate to see what hardware manufacturers were going to bring to market, and what publishers and developers would be able to create after being granted access to these new technologies. This was fueled by a noticeable jump in quality when games transitioned from the 8-bit to the 16-bit era. And this wasn't just related to graphical fidelity. Almost every single aspect was enhanced, including the volume of content packed into the experience and sound quality. Nintendo and Sega had been at the forefront, but the dynamics were changing. During the 3rd generation of consoles, even when combined, the Sega SG-1000 and the Sega Mark III, which was known as the Master System overseas, had a tiny market share in comparison to Nintendo's offering. The family computer, or Famicom, had outsold Sega by a ratio of 19-1 in Japan and 17-1 in North America, with those North American sales almost double that of Japan on both counts. Other consoles were released during this generation, such as the Atari 7800, but their impact was minimal. After seeing the success for Nintendo and Sega, it meant other technology companies realized there was money to be made. And Sega were unwilling to accept their poor position in the home console market, as it did not reflect their dominance in the arcade scene. This then made the next generation of consoles a battleground of iteration and innovation. Throughout the 1980s, NEC were one of the most prominent manufacturers in the PC space thanks to their PC-88 and PC-98 platforms. For a long time, this had been enough. But after they saw the performance of the Famicom, they were forced to accept that the industry was changing. Hyderlight, for example, had sold 1 million copies across every major PC platform, including the PC-88 and 98, but also the Sharp X1, the MSX1 and 2, and more. But even though the Famicom port of Hyderlight was not considered as good, it managed to sell a further 1 million copies on just that one single platform. This was eye-opening for the entire industry. NEC soon partnered with Hudson Soft, a prominent software developer responsible for games such as Bomberman and Doraemon, and they came up with a new piece of hardware called the PC Engine. This was released in October of 1987, just a few months before the original Final Fantasy was released on the Famicom, and within its first 6 months, 600,000 units were sold. This was a very solid start, as the Nintendo Entertainment System had only sold 210,000 units during its first 11 months on sale in North America a few years prior. But NEC were not satisfied, and the following year they launched the CD-ROM, stylized as CD-ROM squared, as an add-on attachment that enabled the base console to play games that used CD-ROM as the storage medium. This then marked the PC Engine as the first CD-ROM based home console, and it also marked the beginning of a new arms race. Even though Nintendo and Sega focused their main offerings on cartridges, thanks to the Super Famicom and the Mega Drive, they too started exploring CD-ROM based options. In 1988, this saw Ken Kutaragi, who worked at Sony, convince Nintendo to use a CD-ROM for the base of their next major console. But it was 1991 that proved to be the pivotal year. Philips launched the CDI, NEC launched a follow-up called the PC Engine Duo, which came with the Super CD-ROM add-on peripheral, and Sega launched the Sega CD, also as an add-on peripheral. And Nintendo, at the summer 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, was set to show off their next major evolution, something that everyone seemed to know about. In the June 1991 edition of Nintendo Power, they even mentioned that the Super Nintendo had been designed to accommodate for the upcoming CD-ROM add-on peripheral that was being jointly developed by Nintendo and Sony. That agreement ended up infamously falling apart, as Nintendo decided to renege on their deal with Sony to strike a deal with Philips instead. A few years later, the next wave of CD-ROM infused consoles arrived. In 1993, this saw purpose-built CD-ROM consoles launched, and this represented the beginning of the 32-bit era. Fujitsu launched the FM Towns Marty in Japan, Amiga launched the CD32 in Europe, and Panasonic launched the 3DO in North America. By the end of 1993, Japan's top creators were constantly being asked their thoughts about the future, as consumers were desperate to understand where they stood in the next console arms race. Due to the status of Square as one of the preeminent developers, this meant Hironobu Sakaguchi stepped forward to give the company's official stance to Famitsu in a wide-ranging interview. He explained that while the company had not started working directly with the CD-ROM medium yet, they had been researching its potential. This had led to numerous ideas being explored, but none had moved forward quite yet. This was partly because they felt no hardware manufacturer had been able to create a product that aligned well with the CD-ROM medium. This sentiment was enforced, in their minds, by very few developers thus far having figured out how to take advantage of its capabilities, despite numerous CD-ROM games being produced. Sakaguchi, though, was confident that the situation would improve, and because of that, he asserted that Square were planning to support the CD-ROM medium in the future. And this assertion came alongside a bold statement. It saw Sakaguchi tell Famitsu that when Square did release its first CD-ROM game, they would make something incredible that would cause a stir. What Sakaguchi did not reveal at this time, though, was that Square had been working on a CD-ROM based game, and that game was due to release on the aforementioned CD-ROM peripheral being co-developed by Sony and Nintendo until issues arose. And those issues persisted well after the deal was struck with Philips, leading to a complete change of plans. So that was the first major factor. But what was the second? While hardware manufacturers were figuring out how to push video games forward and create bigger and better games, Square was wrestling with a similar internal sentiment. Ever since the release of the original Final Fantasy, they had grown from strength to strength as a company, and the people at the top had grand visions. Tetsuo Mizuno had stepped into the role of president and CEO following the surprise departure of the company's founder in 1992, and under his stewardship, Square had become a powerhouse. Between 1992 and 1994, they released 8 games that went on to sell over 9 million copies combined, a figure that was greater than the combined sales of the 23 games they had released between 1986 and 1991. Final Fantasy VI served as the crowning achievement during this period, selling over 1 million copies in its first week on sale, and this then led to an important strategic decision being made. There was an appreciation that even though they had accomplished great things as a company, there were still much bigger players in the industry. Square felt that in order to compete at the level they wanted, they would therefore need to further cement their position, but to do this they would need more money. Everything to date had been self-funded. Initial capital came from the founder and his family's wealth, and subsequent investment was made based on retained profit from the combined revenue streams that were now split across video games, merchandise, and audio production. To be able to compete with the biggest players, however, they would need more. And the only way to achieve this, outside of selling a portion of the company to either a private investment firm or a rival in the space, was to register with the Japanese Securities Dealers Association and offer shares to the public via the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Other companies, such as Namco and Sega, had already taken this route. They both listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 1988 and grew considerably from that point by using the cash injection to invest in their businesses. Square followed suit some 6 years later, as in August of 1994, just 4 months after the launch of Final Fantasy VI, they registered with the Japanese Securities Dealers Association to offer shares to the public. This infused the company with huge amounts of capital, and made those who were key stakeholders in the company incredibly rich. But it also created a new kind of pressure. Ever since the launch of the original Final Fantasy back in 1987, the company's management had shifted to being more risk-conscious and strategy-driven. They had almost exclusively developed games in association with just 4 IP: Final Fantasy, Hanjaku Hero, Saga, and Mana. Amongst these, Final Fantasy had been almost annual, as had Saga. But Saga was also viewed as a cousin of Final Fantasy, created by Akitoshi Kawazu as a way of building upon what he had attempted with Final Fantasy II, while also accommodating to the handheld market as it launched exclusively on the Game Boy. Mana was much the same, overseen by Koichi Ishii for the Game Boy, but this even adorned the Final Fantasy name when it launched in Japan. This new investment was meant to afford Square the opportunity to take more calculated risks and ensure their lofty ambitions could be delivered upon. But as Square had now floated on the stock exchange, this meant there were now many more people with expectations on performance outside of the internal management. And it meant that while before performance was expected, with the team hoping to deliver on their own high standards, it was still a nice to have. If a game failed to perform, it was not going to have severe repercussions for the entire company outside of negative internal performance reviews and some self-reflection. Now though, that was no longer the case. If projects failed to meet expectations, there were to be much bigger consequences. Members of the public who had invested their hard-earned cash didn't just want a game that they could enjoy playing, they also wanted a return on their investment. And if that wasn't delivered upon, they would be able to start asking questions and demanding answers. This meant success was no longer a nice to have, it was now a requirement. After the core team working on Final Fantasy VI had rested and recovered, planning started on Final Fantasy VII with near immediate effect. It was a work hard, play hard environment, and Hironobu Sakaguchi ran a tight ship. He realised that in order to continue building the Final Fantasy IP and maintain momentum against themselves and their competitors, they needed to make sure their games were being released as fast as they could without there being any kind of drop in quality. Some mistakes had been made, and one of these related to the last time there had been a generational shift. This saw Sakaguchi give the green light for the concurrent development of 2 Final Fantasy games, one to launch on the Famicom and one to launch on the Super Famicom, and that they were to be developed by the same people. This ended in near disaster, and the Famicom game was cancelled as a result. But despite these bumps in the road, Sakaguchi's approach had allowed Final Fantasy to close the distance with its main rival, Dragon Quest. Yuji Horii even lamented his own inability to figure out how to develop games as fast. He just hoped that Final Fantasy games started to suffer due to the speed of delivery, but such a hope looked like it was never going to manifest, because despite releasing at a much faster frequency than their contemporaries, Final Fantasy games became known for their excellence when it came to presentation and general game design, and their penchant for innovation. By this point, the longest gap between Final Fantasy releases had been just 506 days, or just under 17 months, whereas the average time, when discounting the original Final Fantasy, was 459 days, or just 15 months. It meant fans of the franchise never had to wait much more than a year to experience a brand new game adorning the Final Fantasy name, and based on that approach, and that Final Fantasy VI had spent less time in development than Final Fantasy V, the target release for Final Fantasy VII was assumed to have been 1995. But that then led to questions about what kind of game Final Fantasy VII was going to be in order to deliver it that quickly. Square had numerous choices available to them. Even though progress was slow, Nintendo were still working with Philips on their CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Famicom, known as the Super Famicom CD-ROM adapter in Japan. Technical specifications were even shown off throughout 1993, but Square had ultimately lost faith in the project due to their own issues regarding the development of Seiken Densetsu 2. There was also the potential for the next generation. 1993 had seen 3 purpose-built CD-ROM home consoles delivered to market, and it was clear that cartridge-based solutions were going to have a serious challenge. New, more powerful systems were expected to start being delivered to market within the next 1 to 2 years, and Sega showed off their upcoming Saturn console at the Tokyo Toy Show just 2 months after Final Fantasy VI had shipped. These 2 avenues proposed an interesting quandary for Square. Between 1986 and 1994, they had fostered a strong relationship with Nintendo, and due to the strength of that relationship, they had not produced video games for home or handheld consoles produced by any other hardware manufacturer. In spite of the issues around the CD-ROM peripheral, they still wanted to support Nintendo as best as they could, and that then led to 2 more potential options, both of which were based around producing another game for the Super Famicom in its vanilla form. These 2 options were create a 16-bit game that was safer and quicker with a very similar art style to Final Fantasy VI, but with a new cast of characters and world, fresh gameplay systems and original battle design, or create a 16-bit game that was a bit more unorthodox in terms of how it evolved. Square knew that companies like Rare were exploring new graphical possibilities, as it was common knowledge that they had purchased a bunch of Silicon Graphics Inc. workstations and licenses to Alias, a rendering software that allowed the creation of 3D models. This enabled Rare to start playing around with the use of 3D models in a 2D environment and create full CGI renders, thus making bitmapping redundant. The fruits of their labour were shown off at the 1994 Summer International Consumer Electronics Show, which was held in Chicago, as Donkey Kong Country wowed audiences. The challenge was that SGI workstations were not cheap, and the skill set of those employed by Square was suited more to 2D pixel art than the creation of complex 3D models. This all then helped to influence the decision as to what kind of game Final Fantasy VII should be, as in order to hit the proposed deadline, they couldn't afford to spend a lot of time doing research and development, and rushing something like that would more likely lead to a diminishment in quality. This then meant most of the options were discounted. CD-ROM was not a viable format as Nintendo was still struggling to put out their peripheral, and at this point, Square had no interest in listening to alternative hardware vendors, and creating an evolved 16-bit game was just not viable at this time, as it would require a significant upfront investment in the form of both time and money, as workstations would need to be purchased and staff retrained. It meant there was only one realistic option left that could play to their strengths and ensure they hit the target release window: create a brand new 16-bit game that was a subtle evolution of Final Fantasy V and VI. The broader ambitions would then be shelved until such a time that the hardware providers had managed to figure out what the next console generation was actually going to look like. During the off period after Final Fantasy VI was complete, there was the usual transition period. Some members of the team were destined to either leave the company or join other teams to take on more seniority and lead, or to simply experience working on different kinds of projects with other people. Regardless, once the dust had settled and most of the logistics were handled, a new conceptual development team was formed to start exploring Final Fantasy VII, and it retained the same core. Yoshinori Kitase, who was still only 28 at the time, continued as one of the most senior figures, and he was joined by numerous individuals from across the various other disciplines. Tetsuya Nomura, Tetsuya Takahashi, and Yosuke Naora were all there as prominent representatives from the art division. Ken Narita and Kiyoshi Yoshi, who had become a solid programming duo, were also involved, as they had been for the 5 previous games, to discuss the technical aspects of what the project would look like. And it can also be assumed at this stage that venerable creator Hiroyuki Ito, who had served as the co-director on Final Fantasy VI, was also involved, alongside the likes of Keisuke Matsuhara, who had helped Kitase to ensure the scenario of Final Fantasy VI flowed and made sense. All in all, this skeleton crew consisted of around 20 to 30 people who, just like when they started work on Final Fantasy VI, were going to spend a few months establishing how they could push the franchise forward yet again. On the 18th of July 1994, 3 months after Final Fantasy VI had shipped, and not long after the discovery process for Final Fantasy VI had been underway, Kitase presented a vision for the game. His key phrase was density over length, something he wanted to accomplish by making a game that was relatively quick to finish in comparison to Final Fantasy VI, but was much more detailed, with a ton of replay value due to branching narratives and optional story developments. That replay value was then to be delivered through 3 main narrative concepts. 1. Creating a story that took place over 2 different time periods. 2. Ensuring players had the freedom to select whichever party members they wanted as soon as possible. And 3. To make sure the story was less linear, with optional events incorporated at random intervals to ensure a degree of dynamism from playthrough to playthrough. The first concept was wide-reaching, with it planned to influence how the story played out and how the characters progressed themselves. Throughout the development of Final Fantasy V, Kitase and Nomura had struck up a close working relationship. It had led to them discussing game ideas on a regular basis, sometimes at the office, but sometimes late at night on the weekend. And one of the concepts they came up with was the notion of there being 2 main protagonists. As a huge fan of film, Kitase had been impressed by the way movies had used this concept, with The Godfather Part 2 serving as a specific reference. The main point of differentiation for them, though, was that they wanted players to be able to have direct control over sequences that took place in the present as well as the past. But they also wanted to make sure that the narrative was structured in such a way that even though decisions taking place in the past would affect the future, the game wouldn't end up as a weird imitation of Back to the Future, where decisions taken in the past could have drastic consequences for the future. But choice was going to be a factor, and there would be minor ripple effects. Kitase planned for there to be 2 distinct narrative objectives. The past arc would be focused on the father, with the present arc focused on their child. The past was therefore going to have a central focus on the personal growth of the father, the feats they accomplished, and the impact those feats had on civilization. And the present arc was going to focus on character growth influenced by genes inherited from the father, the progeny seeing how the people spoke of their father based on what he had accomplished, and seeing how civilization developed based on the actions of their father. There was to be a 3-act structure, with each act split into 2 parts. The father's arc was always planned to go first, with the child's arc there to show the present-day consequences. Kitase listed one of the unique selling points being that certain elements of the story were not set in stone. In-game events started undetermined, and how the father acted then affected ancillary elements in the story and character development. Specific examples were offered through 3 different types of scenario relating to progression, events, and dungeons. In the case of the former, an event called the Two-Handed Branch was explored. It highlighted how, if the father used 2-handed weapons in the past and they became proficient enough to the point where they earned the 2-handed skill, they would then write down their learnings in a book to be passed on. In the subsequent present-day story segment, if the child found the book, they would unlock the 2-handed skill. And if they then mastered it, in the next past arc, a new event would play highlighting how the father had tried to teach the child certain skills when they were small, with the child reminiscing and then remembering things. The event scenarios were to be handled in a similar manner, adapting based on player choice. The example given here was called Dragon Extermination. As part of the narrative, a dragon was meant to attack a village. However, it was optional as to whether the father chose to A. even visit the village, and then B. help to actually fight the dragon off. These options then would have consequences. For example, if the father did visit the village and opted not to help, then the descendants of those who had died at the hands of the village would remember the father as a coward. In the present, random occurrences were also planned to dynamically alter the quest. For example, if the child learnt that a villager's wife had been captured by the dragon, then the father in the past would be then required to save her. The dungeon scenarios then had the potential to unlock some powerful rewards. In one dungeon, for example, the father could seal a weapon away to become imbued over time by drops from a magical spring. The deeper into the dungeon the weapon was sealed, the stronger it had the potential to become in the present. The weapon the child found was therefore dynamic on multiple levels. For example, if the father left a regular sword and took it to the deepest level, it could become Excalibur, but if they left a katana, it could become the Masamune. The second, broader concept was much easier to accomplish. Final Fantasy VI had a clear division thanks to the World of Balance and the World of Ruin. It was only in the latter half that the players were given much more choice about their party composition, and Kitase wanted to ensure choice was offered much sooner, with very few mandated scenarios or enforced switches. He also felt as though they had made a big mistake with the sheer volume of protagonists, as they considered there to be 12 viable main characters with a few outliers. This then made it very difficult to create compelling narrative arcs for each of them. They therefore wanted to impose a strict limit of just 8 mandatory characters. The story was to then play out the same, irrespective of who the party chose, but there would be small nuances that came through in terms of unique dialogue options if certain characters were present during specific scenes. The third strand then related to linearity and replay value. Some of these concepts were already related to the first 2 ideas, with gameplay actions, random events, and even the party the player selected influencing subtle nuances in the story. But Kitase also wanted there to be a purposeful nature to how the story developed as well. This was to come through via information gathering, a concept designed to reward players who spoke to NPCs and just explored the world. If enough information was gathered, new events and dungeons had the potential to start appearing. But the order of these occurrences was not mandated, and they could also be missed entirely if the player did not seek out enough information. Beyond that, Kitase also proposed the concept of a comet crashing into the planet, with the Chosen Ones being dispatched to try and stop it before it caused a calamity, that commands should be fluid, with only attack and item being mandatory and everything else based on player choice, and the assignment of these commands was to then be handled by equipping commands to slots within armor and weapons. And Kitase even proposed the notion of event sequences happening as part of a random encounter, whereby a sub-map would appear and the party would be able to converse. There was also the suggestion that a character should almost drown before needing to be resuscitated in a life or death situation. What Kitase did not have, however, was an actual story draft, and this was provided by Sakaguchi. The plan was for Final Fantasy VII to serve as a complete departure from previous games, so Sakaguchi sought to have the game be set in an alternate version of New York City circa 1999. Focus was then going to be placed on a radical organization that was attempting to destroy something within the city called macro reactors, colossal power plants that were being used to fuel everything. After catching wind of their plan, a hot-blooded detective called Joe was to investigate this organization, and the first act of the game was to follow Joe as he chased members of the organization around the city while trying to prevent them from blowing up the macro reactors. In the initial draft, Joe was chasing 3 characters who were connected with the radical organization. One of them was a cool and calm mercenary wielding a sword, one of them was a woman who had power over magic, and the final member was an aggressive hulking man who used a gun. This group, who were to be the game's protagonists, were to end up succeeding in their goals, and the city was to have been completely destroyed as a consequence. Act 2 was then to see Joe continuing to pursue the protagonists around the world, with the scenario being more akin to an urban crime drama than the typical narrative players had become accustomed to. But even during this short period of discovery, things changed. The city, for example, was transitioned from being a modern interpretation of the actual New York City to being a location that was merely inspired by it, and as such, it was given the new name of Midgar. Time was also spent on developing the characters, but this time Sakaguchi opted to make a significant change. Up until that point, Yoshitaka Amano and Kazuka Shibuya had largely been responsible for designing the main characters of the game. But after being impressed by Tetsuya Nomura's unorthodox ideas and working style throughout the development of Final Fantasy VI, he opted to work with Nomura instead. Despite serving as one of the art directors on Final Fantasy VI and working on the backstories of numerous characters, Nomura still felt he was quite a junior member of the team. After all, his first major credit had only been Final Fantasy V, as even though he had been at the company during the development of Final Fantasy IV, he had only worked on the QA. The prospect of working this closely with Sakaguchi brought a ton of pressure, but Sakaguchi had made his decision and there was no choice but to adapt. Due to the pressure, Nomura, who was himself inspired by Amano, felt the need to try and emulate his style, as the designs he'd created from the previous installments had become synonymous with Final Fantasy. As such, he tried to come up with characters that were glamorous and extravagant, as a way of creating a fusion between Amano's lavish style and his own clean and precise style. One of these characters was a witch. She was to serve as one of the game's main antagonists in this initial vision for the game, there to be either a servant or direct accomplice to the big bad. Two other characters were also designed during this period, and they embodied the same sentiment, with designs that oozed personality. It was believed they were designed in such a way that they wouldn't have seemed out of place in a shonen manga from the past. With Nomura hard at work, Sakaguchi then placed Kitase in charge of delivering on his vision for the game. They needed to produce something that was superior to Final Fantasy VI while working towards that tight deadline. It was at this point that, similar to how they had worked on Final Fantasy VI, serious brainstorming started to take place amongst the core members of the team. Kitase, of course, had his own ideas he wanted to try and incorporate into the story, but he also liked to have an open dialogue with the team. So it was at this point that everyone was asked to propose ideas that related to either already established or new characters and potential gameplay systems. No ideas were bad, but there was also no guarantee that they would end up being used. But by leading in this way, Kitase ensured that people always vocalized their ideas instead of keeping them hidden for fear of rejection. He wanted people to bring their A game, and this initial phase, when everything was fresh and exciting, was when that sentiment was most important. With the plan laid out, everything was set up for Final Fantasy to launch a fourth major game on the Super Famicom, something that was unprecedented across all publishers and genres, let alone those making role-playing games. There was just one problem. Ever since the release of the original Final Fantasy, that franchise had been put on a pedestal by Square. Other franchises had been created and were also successful in their own right, but Final Fantasy was the main attraction, and its development team was even classified as the first team. But Sakaguchi was an ambitious man. In 1990, he had his first interaction with Kazuhiko Torishima, the influential editor of Weekly Shonen Jump. It was not a positive interaction, as Torishima spent over 2 hours criticizing Final Fantasy III during a one-on-one meeting at an advertising conference. But by the release of Final Fantasy VI, Torishima had grown to respect Sakaguchi's ability to tell an engrossing story, even collaborating on an extensive campaign to promote the game, which included original comic strips, a dedicated feature called the Final Fantasy Coliseum, and even some promotional VHS tapes. Due to the strengthening of this relationship, a plan was hatched, and this plan revolved around creating a brand new role-playing game that was conceived by what was akin to the Dream Team. This included Sakaguchi and Torishima, but also Yuji Horii and Akira Toriyama. Even though Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy had been painted as rivals, and they very much were competing for space in the minds of consumers, their hard-earned cash and their leisure time, it had developed into more of a friendly rivalry. They did each, of course, want to come out on top and be the first to bring innovations to market, but the influential pair of Horii and Sakaguchi had spoken numerous times of their respect for one another, as the rivalry had brought out the best in them. It also happened that Torishima knew Horii very well, and was even responsible for unearthing the incredible talents of Toriyama. The collaboration therefore made sense, and it had been attempted for some time, with Toriyama even on board as early as 1991, as there were talks about Final Fantasy transitioning over to being an action-orientated role-playing game for its fourth major iteration. But after Sakaguchi vetoed that idea, the Final Fantasy IV action RPG prototype, which was being overseen by Hiromichi Tanaka, was turned into its own project and given the codename Chrono Trigger. This project then became tied up with the infamous Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on peripheral and morphed into Seiken Densetsu 2, with many of the initial elements being stripped back, including most of Toriyama's contributions. But in October of 1992, Sakaguchi met with Hori and Toriyama, and they vowed to create something that was akin to a fusion between Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and the initial name for this project was Maru Island. It too was planned for the Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on peripheral. But when that peripheral was cancelled, the decision was taken to revise the project, and the now free Chrono Trigger name was resurfaced. Due to the nature of the game, a huge team was put in place to ensure it could deliver on the no doubt huge consumer expectations, and development started in earnest towards the beginning of 1993. But despite the workforce, numerous issues were encountered. Over a year later, after Final Fantasy VI had been shipped and Final Fantasy VII was entering into its initial planning phase, those issues were becoming even more pronounced. And it meant that before any serious development was able to commence, the decision was taken to shut down production on Final Fantasy VII in favour of the team helping out on Chrono Trigger instead, as it was considered a much bigger priority. What happened next, we'll discuss in part 2 of this exploration into the incredible development history of Final Fantasy VII. But with that, thank you so much for watching, everyone. Hopefully, as you did watch through, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the efforts that we put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. Because in truth, any interactions you make do really help the channel out. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.